Okay, so just a word about Nico. Dr. Nico Buitendag. Nico was born in Johannesburg in 1986. He grew up in Johannesburg, in Stellenbosch, and in Pretoria. He matriculated in Menlo Park High School, Pretoria, where after he played professional rugby in France for 5 years. And then he began to study law directly after school, and he received a degree, LLB, and then an LLM degree at Pretoria. Then he went to the Netherlands, got another master's degree in law, LLM there in Leiden, and then went to Japan, to Kyoto, where he got his PhD in law. He was a visiting researcher at the Niklas Luhmann Archive in Bielefeld, Germany, and he is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Law at the Northwest University and just received an advanced postdoc appointment. So congratulations on that again, Nico. Something about Nico's research, believing that current global questions ask for broad structural responses. Dr. Buitendag conducts transdisciplinary theoretical research that bridges law, politics, sociology, historiography, and philosophy. This has led to publications connecting theory to practical cases, such as political hate speech trials, sanctioned police violence at Marikana, the death of Steve Biko at the hands of the state, and border conflicts between Ethiopia and Eritrea. This also resulted in the translation of several works of Niklas Luhmann, the late pioneer of auto-created systems theory, from German into English. And then a short word about his book he's launching, States of Exclusion, a critical systems theory of international law. One, I think, outstanding thing of the book is that it really furthered this transdisciplinary research of Nico, where he looks at politics, law, science, philosophy, systems, all of that tend to see how states are furthering their own powers, their own interests, and he's criticizing it from the beginning to end. Especially from a colonialist perspective. And you will see in his book, he focuses a lot on the Berlin Conference of 1884, where especially the Africa continent were divided between colonial states. Forming an effort, I think, to seek, and that's a more philosophical approach, to seek the truth and the influences behind international law. To understand why it is still oppressive, why it's still an unjust system where we live, and how can we change it? What sort of critique are needed? He ends his book by referring that we should, or pleading, that we should think more cross-border in our international law, to think about things that are moving across borders that affects us in so many aspects, like climate change, migration, and he also mentioned global pandemics. So you can already sense the importance of his thinking about rethinking international law with all the influences that's at play when we write it. We know the power of international law, that it can oppress. That's one of the things we saw, and the need, of course, to I think, write better international law. Is what Nico, I think, aimed for. But that's what I guess. Nico, we're looking forward to hear from you about your book and more the context of the book. Let's just give him a hand.
Yes, thank you very much, Anné. I think after that summary, my job is done. Yeah, we can go have snacks. No, thank you. So first of all, I also, although I thank people, I also want to thank personally a few people, of course. First of all, I want to thank Oasis Books, the publisher of the book, and their staff and their team that helped me through the process of publication. They were very helpful, and in particular, especially Professor Andries van Aarde, who was not only part of the editorial team, but is also someone I consider a personal friend of mine. He is here online. Also when I was hospitalized a few years ago during the research for this book in Germany, Professor van Aarde made a lot of effort to reach out to me in that time and try to help me, and that's something I appreciate. So he's not only, I don't only have a professional relationship, but I also have a friendship with him that I appreciate. I also want to say thank you to Anné, Verhoef, and Mitzi Wiese for initiating this opportunity for me to speak today about the book. Thank you very much for organizing this. And then, in the details of the organizing, I especially want to thank Ms. Fente, who did the hard work of organizing the practical side and did so much that I personally did not need to worry about anything. You were very dependable and made everything go very smoothly. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I also want to welcome especially my colleagues from the law faculty, Professor Wagner, and others, and especially my supervisor, or perhaps now my ex-supervisor, Professor Wilhelmine Duplessis. Thank you for, 2 years ago when I arrived in Potchefstroom, you welcomed me so kindly and helped me and guided me and made me feel welcome in the Northwest. Thank you very much. And I learned later through our time that Professor Wilhelmine is actually something of a legend in the law faculty. So thank you for that honor. I also want to thank Professor Susan Visser, who's also my landlady, but that's an understatement. It's much more the way you helped me both at the university, but also especially privately, me and my family. I think our existence in Potchefstroom would not be possible if it wasn't for the millions of things that you do for us daily. Then, of course, to my partner, Chair, thank you very much. Chair, don't blush. 今までお世話なりに本当にありがとうございました。And then, of course, to my family who's here, who came from Pretoria, thank you very much. Of course, you've been supporting me from day zero. So thank you very much for that. So I don't want to talk necessarily strictly about the contents of the book. That's also strategic, because if I do that, then no one needs to read it afterwards. So I'm not going to talk specifically about the contents, but I want to sort of talk around the book, about the context of the book. First of all, in 2019, the Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han published a book called The Disappearance of Ritual. And he defines ritual as symbolic acts that bring forth community without communication. And from the title of the book, you can guess he's saying that rituals are disappearing and that this is a big loss for society. And rather than having these symbolic acts that bring forth community without communication, we now live in a time where there's an excess of communication that does not bring about community. I would add that we don't call that community, that's society. He says what I quite like. He says that ritual has the same function in time that the home has in space. Rituals are the time that we find ourselves at home, temporarily speaking. And then he also acknowledges that while ritual is important, it also has a role in reifying existing hierarchical structures. So rituals are what we can call a pharmacon. It's something that's good and bad. Pharmacon, if you think medicine can save your life. If you take too much medicine, it also becomes a poison. So ritual has this dual function that it serves. So why do I begin with this? Is because I want to, despite Anné giving a short overview of my biography, I want to go into detail in some of the biography in the years leading up to this book and why this afternoon or this evening is important for me. As Anné said, I did a LLM at Leiden University. And, I was young. I had limited money. I had to work it out exactly to be able to do that study. Europe is expensive, so it worked out in a way that I gave my master's thesis in months before the deadline, months before anyone else in my class. My final exam was, if I remember correctly, it was 3 days before my return ticket to South Africa. So I wrote that exam, went home, packed up everything, threw everything away, and got on a plane and came back to South Africa. So I was already sitting back home here when I heard that I passed my exams, I passed my thesis, and of course they say you're invited to the graduation ceremony. And of course, I'm not going to fly to Holland just for a graduation. So I said, no, thank you. And they mailed me the certificate and it was fine. And I thought, it's not so important I'll go to my graduation for my LLD. That's the important one. I'll do that. And then I went to Japan. I stayed there for a few years studying, met Chie, and towards the last year or so of my study, I felt the need to go to Germany to work in the Niklas Luhmann Archive, to do archival work there. And I thought I would come back a few months before handing in my thesis, finish up the thesis, and go back to Japan, and everything will be fine. This was in 2019, and so off I went to Germany with Chie with me, and we were there, and then she fell pregnant. And this was early 2020. And I still had about 3 months or so left before I had to finish my thesis. And, being, two strangers in a strange country, no support system, under a lot of stress, we decided to let her go to Japan. I said, you go to Japan, give me 2 or 3 months more to finish my thesis, the work, the research that this book was based on, and I'll come back to Japan in 3 months to go hand in my work. And so she flew to Japan, and of course, as you can imagine, early 2020, in the months or the weeks subsequent to her leaving, COVID spread and there was lockdown all over the world. And especially in Japan, it was very strict. And suddenly no foreign national could enter Japan. Even though I had a valid study visa at the time for the country, I was enrolled at the university still at that time, but I could not enter. And I thought, no, this is okay. Things are changing day by day. I'll be able to hand in or get back before I need to hand in at the deadline. But the time came and I couldn't go back. So, eventually I emailed it in. A colleague printed out, bound my thesis, handed it in. And I thought, no, it's okay. In 2 or 3 months, I'll have the defense. I'll be back before then. Time passed. I was going to the Japanese consulate in Dresden daily, not daily, very often trying to beg them to let me into the country. A lot of letters, but they just wouldn't budge. And the day for the defense came, and I did the defense, on Zoom or whatever. And I still remember doing the defense, and after the defense, to say, "Well done, you passed, you got your degree." And I remember walking. I snuck into campus to use the office internet. I remember walking out of the building, looking at this empty campus, thinking, I defended, I got my degree, now what? There's not a single person in sight. And I thought I'd go to the graduation. Graduation came, I missed that too. Eventually I was in an interview with the Consulate General of Japan in Germany, and she gave me something like an emergency entry permit or something, and I was fortunately able to somehow get back into the country just in time for the birth of our son. But I think I was one of the very, very few foreigners to enter Japan in 2020. So the point of this long story, and it will become more relevant later, but firstly, the point of this story is to say that this ritual, this home in time, was something that evaded me numerous times. And in many respects, today, having this party here is, for me, the ritual, the home in time that I missed. So thank you for this chance. So to get to the book, why? I think a good question would be, why do a study? Why do research now on a concept so basic, so fundamental as the sovereignty of a state? Something that we take for granted so much, something that our legal system takes as such a presupposition. Why do such fundamental research? And here's the other reason for telling you this long story about the last few years. I think the story illustrates a lot of what is the problem of the nation-state sovereign system that we have. We are no longer living in a modern nation-state segmented society. I think we can all agree we are living in a world society, meaning we're living in a society with one economy, one scientific system, by implication, one education system. We have international relationships. We have international working conditions. The story of COVID also brings us up. Just to stay with the example, Japan had extremely strict border control. Of course, COVID also came to Japan. Many people got it. Every country that tried to prevent it got COVID. It spread all over the world. And then perhaps most alarmingly is, of course, the climate crisis that is coming, which is not going to respect national borders or nationality. In fact, everything seems to indicate that national sovereignty is going to be weaponized against the global south when when the climate crisis, when those chickens are going to come home to roost. So I don't think doing work or addressing such a fundamental question as state sovereignty is something that belongs to the past. I think this is a critical question that ties with so many problems, and it's worth looking at. And of course, I'm not the only one who says this. As you heard, I worked at the Niklas Luhmann Archive. Niklas Luhmann wrote in his magnum opus in 1998, Die Gesellschaft der Gesellschaft, a quote that I would like to read. I'm going to read the English translation, but at some point I want to switch to the German to make a point later. But in 1998, Luhmann wrote, the idea of nation obviously belongs to the set of short-lived semantics that can exercise a fascination for a transitional period. This idea is now on the wane, a phase in which it does more harm than good, and from a sociological point of view, constitutes an epistemological obstacle. So this is what Luhmann, a sociologist, said in the 90s. Much more recently, last year, South Africa's own Breitenbach at a philosophy cafe meeting in the Cape. In a different context, and I would be very surprised if Breitenbach has ever read an obscure German sociologist. But he said, and I'm going to quote this too, and I'm going to keep it in the original Afrikaans, if that's okay. Breitenbach said, the transcription of this talk that he gave is on Litnet. He said, die staat is nie ons nie. Ons kan onsself nie daarin herken of dink dat ons dit teenoor wie ook al sal regverdig nie. Miskien is dit 'n natuurlike evolusie. Miskien is die konsep verouderd en dien dit weinig nut. Baie van ons, die wat dit kan bekostig of die wat nooit gekwalifiseer het vir toelating tot die staat nie, lewe in ieder geval daaromheen. Between these two quotes, the resonances are amazing. It's, 25 years apart, more or less. But the themes are quite similar. The first one is this idea of the state being a phase in evolution. Luhmann says it's an idea that could exercise fascination for a transitional period, and the idea is on the wane. Breitenbach explicitly says, miskien is dit 'n natuurlike evolusie. There's this, it's an evolutionary phase. There's something after this. The second theme or resonance between these two quotes that I see is the one of use, usefulness, nut. Breitenbach says, die konsep is verouderd, dit dien weinig nut. Luhmann, he says it's a phase which does more harm than good. The German says, wir finden uns heute in dieser Idee, in der sie mehr Schaden als Nutzen stiftet. Mehr Skade as nut. It does more. So that's why I wanted to go to the German. More harm than good is okay, but he says more damage than usefulness. it's an idea that, and I think Luhmann expresses this stronger than Buitendag. It's not just a question of usefulness. Luhmann even goes further and says it's an idea that causes harm, Schaden. And then finally, the third resonance is the one of exclusion. And I find this quite moving in Buitendag when he says, die van ons wat nooit gekwalifiseer het vir toelating tot die staat, those of us who never qualified for inclusion in the state. We think of the state, the nation, as something that includes us. But what if it never included us? It never included Buitendag, not this state, not the previous state. Have we not confused inclusion for a uniformity that paradoxically has intensified difference? What if the true nature of the state is not a political community based on consensus, but one based on dissensus, one based on difference? This is, of course, something that was already recognized by the legal and political theorist Carl Schmitt, who defined this in his characteristically blunt way as a distinction between the friend and the enemy. So the idea that the state is not something that includes us, but something that excludes us is the fundamental or the central premise of this book. So how does it develop that? I don't want to be so boring as to go through a chapter by chapter overview. Rather, what I would prefer to do is to take one of the theoretical concepts that is central for Luhmann's systems theory, the theory that is the basis of this book, and talk about that a bit more. And that is the concept of communication. Remember, we said ritual is community without communication, and communication gives us a society without community. So Luhmann always speaks of communication as the fundamental currency of society. I changed that in the book, not to develop it further as such, but to emphasize the other side of communication, the dark side of communication, if you will, the communication without community. And in the book, I changed Luhmann's idea of communication into what I call excommunication. So why the word excommunication, or what am I trying to achieve through doing that? So as we know, the word excommunication has a religious root to it. It's a punishment given most typically by the Catholic Church. What does excommunication do? It's not a direct punishment. It's not banishment or exile. Excommunication is excluding the person from the rituals of the church, from the rituals of the community. You don't have to leave. You don't have to go into exile like Buitendag did. You can stay here, but only as a body. You're not taking further part in our communication, in our ritual. It is a communication that carries in itself its own negation. It's the communication that says, you will not be communicated with anymore. That's the punishment. And if we look at the history of international law, public international, for much of the world, this was the history. International law had, I will say, up until the 20th century, had complex rules and norms to decide who gets to be part of the family of nations. The most famous and perhaps the most pernicious one of this was, of course, the requirement of civilization. You could be regarded as a state if you reached a sufficient level of civilization. So many parts of the world, South America, Africa, much of Asia, was excluded from the rituals, from the communication of public international law. In that sense, they were excommunicated. They were allowed to be there, but you don't take part in our talks. And we could say, okay, but that time is over. After the League of Nations, the UN, the decolonization period or movement, we're all included now. I mean, now there is not a single polity on earth that's not included in public international law. The Bandung Conference. But this is perhaps also not enough. Is this true inclusion? Firstly, for many states, first they were excluded, then included, and in many regards, regretfully included into the family of nations. Unequal treaties proliferated. Suddenly, I prefer to use the word polities, or political communities had to take part in a system that they had no initial say in creating. So my question is it also not possible that not only inclusion, or not only exclusion, but inclusion into the system of statehood and into the family of nations also symbolizes a kind of an end to communication in a different way? How does that work? And the point is that I would like to make is that law in itself, of course, we have legal communication, but law in itself is also a form of ending of communication. As soon as we go from communication in other spheres to the legal sphere, a lot of themes of communication are suddenly excluded. The only thing that remains when we enter law is that we can now call on the authority of law. When we make legal claims, when we become states, a polity becomes a state, we define ourselves and our expectations. We show an unwillingness to learn from another party, and we commit ourselves to our expectations. And we say if they are not met, legal action will be taken, legal consequences will follow. So in a sense, when we enter the legal sphere, we no longer need to communicate. Legal norms does the talking for us. All these other themes are done. You say, in a sense, you say, don't talk to me, talk to my lawyer. When you become a state, all your other ideas of political organization, of how you would like to interact with other polities outside of your own, all these other opportunities are cut off and centered in a single mode of communication. It also, I think, the power of looking at it this way, analytically, is that it shows the fractured and decentered nature of power, the networked nature of power. That power is no longer hierarchical, but that it's lying in the connections between states, in the communication itself. It also, why the other advantage that I think exclusion as a concept brings is that it allows us to get rid of outmoded Marxist modes of thinking, such as unhelpful terms such as exploitation. The problem in the world now is not exploitation. It's not exploitation of the global south. And I've been criticized for this idea. So please, it's a nuanced point I'm trying to make. The problem of society now is not classical Marxist exploitation. The problem is exclusion. What? If we look at, and I'm saying this with pathos, the most deprived communities in the world, what can they be exploited for? They're not being exploited. The travesty is their exclusion from world society. So I think I've reached my time limit, but I think being cognizant of the historical and structural conditions in the shaping of public international law is essential for addressing future problems such as inequality, pandemics that we are being told are going to become a part of our normal life, and of course, the climate crisis, which is, I think, in almost any academic endeavor, the elephant in the room. And that hopefully some of these concepts can help us address these very real and very scary problems that we have on the horizon. That's my spiel. Thank you very much. So now it's question and answer. Well, question time. I don't know if it's answer time, but so we're only a handful, so I think we can do it casually. If anyone has a question, I'll try my best to answer. And also for those who are online, if you would like to answer a question, just simply put on your mic and start speaking. That's fine.
Certain, I was called populations. What does exclusion mean exactly? And so do they perceive themselves as being excluded? Because I always find that these terms are very much in the eye of the beholder. So we might think that somebody is being excluded or being marginalized, but that might not be how they experience it or perceive it. So if we say excluded, what do we mean by that? Having safe in a lot of things?
Thank you. I think the exclusion manifests in very different spheres of society or in different social systems. in international law itself, we're sitting, to take a very obvious example, we're sitting with unjustified bodies such as the Security Council and the United Nations, which were the Allied powers after World War II, who still now have a disproportionate say economically. Poverty excludes you from the economic system. You need money to take part in economics. If you don't have money, you're excluded from that system. Politically, how many people do not have a political voice or are not involved in decision making? So I think, look at the climate crisis. States keep meeting up in Kyoto, in Paris, in Egypt. They talk and they talk and they talk and nothing happens. While I think the majority of people sense a very real frustration with this. So I think exclusion manifests in many systems on many levels. I'm using it quite broadly now, but I think we could get specific in hundreds of examples. Yes, Yolanda.
Okay. So perhaps my question is a bit of an unfair one, because I don't think this is part of your project, but you seem to have given us a kind of symptomatology, right? You've given us the symptoms, you've diagnosed that disease, but do you have a kind of forward-looking proposal? So what comes after the state? What comes? So we've diagnosed these problems, we've said that it excludes people. What comes beyond that? What's post-state?
Yes, that's of course an important question. It's one that I cannot answer myself. But of course, it's something I ask myself a lot too. And I think this is a direction in which we need to invest our time and energy in, to finding these solutions. And of course, the state system started in early modernity in Europe as a vast project. Philosophically, Hobbes, Locke, you had the thousands of names of people that we've forgotten who did the intellectual work on this. We had bureaucrats and armies. It took generations and centuries of probably literally millions of people to establish the system that we have now. Over hundreds of years. It would be impossible for one person to come up with a viable alternative by himself. But on the other hand, it's been done once. Even the monarchical state was also an evolutionary phase that took a lot of work. It's been done once, it's been done twice. It's something that can be done again, I'm sure. Yeah, I can't do it alive, but in theory, it should be able to be done. Rishad, are you going to go at me for the Marxist comment?
No. I fully agree. I know that will be. So I really love what you said about the moment you sort of enter the legal discourse, it shuts down all sorts of other discourse. You have to engage with legal discourse. So I'm wondering what you think about legal education, because that's kind of our position, right? I start my constitutional law year saying, hey, listen, we've got the state, it's kind of a social construct, results of history and all this sort of stuff. The students then absorb that for the half hour that I teach them about that. But in the rest of the year, I need to play the constitutional game. I need to say the state is there and this is how it works in the room. And all of us sort of have to take these assumptions for granted in our teaching. We can't be anarchists in the classroom the way that our work currently goes. So what do you think we should be doing in legal education? Can we ever get to these fundamental questions in what we teach?
That's an important question. I'm going to give you a systems theory answer. What is the function of the education system? Luhmann gives a very cynical answer. He says that the education system is, he says, we're past the romantic idea, especially like in the German tradition, we're past these romantic ideas of development of Bildung in education. The function of the education system in society is for worker placement. The education sorts us into, you get to be a lawyer, you get to be a carpenter, you get to be a accountant. And this is a system separate from the political system, separate from the legal system even. I mean, legal education is, at the end of the day, the emphasis is on education, not on what you're doing is education. The law part is just the content of what you're doing. So the cynical answer would be that you cannot affect political change through the education system. Political change has to happen through the political system. Legal change has to happen through the legal system. I personally see a lot of, I mean, I'm biased. I went to Germany to read this guy's papers, so I'm biased towards this view. It makes a lot of sense to me. You're welcome to disagree, but I think that's the problem. I use myself a lot as an example.
I would just say cynical answer about the education system. Well, I had a totally different political viewpoint before I started studying at the Christian higher education at that stage, because we had very enlightened professors at the law faculty who was against apartheid, and they made me reconsider my underdeveloped political thinking at that stage. So I do think that education has a great role to play in the political climate, I think, because if it was not for Lotus de Plessis, Johan van der Vyver, all of them, I would probably have a different view about politics. And I hate politics, but I mean, I think I would have developed in another direction, was it not? And they taught law, and they used the law to change my views.
I thank you. Because I don't want to put you on the spot, but apart from your views changing, how that made an impact politically, except perhaps maybe for who you voted for.
I transferred that knowledge to the next generation, and hopefully something. I mean, if I just think of, there were also professors that were in the very conservative side of politics. And all in here, was it? I'm talking about very long ago. 85, 86. So, no, yeah. Hopefully they go into the fields with the enlightened ideas. I stayed behind. I went to Department of Justice first. Then I also started to question some of the things that we did in the Department of Justice. So even though it's not tangible, I do think that we start to rethink things that we were doing. So the fact that you can't, you don't have physical evidence of those changes. I do think, I mean, you should know it, you're a philosopher, so philosophy is also not always tangible. But you still believe in philosophy and
Yes.
those ideas. My worldview changed, and if mine changed and I transferred it onto somebody else because that was transferred onto me, don't that triple effect make me change at the end?
Yes, I agree. It will.
So you can do it negatively or positively, and you can use the law negatively and positively. Maybe I've got a more rosy.
No, I think I agree with you. Certainly in education, we can teach and it can change the minds of individuals. But that would still be contingent on that individual going out in society and making a political change. And we don't know if that will happen or not. You don't know what change they will make. I think so. This is a very indirect. The causal chain is a very long one in this case. And I think the point that I was making to Gashard was that you cannot teach political change. You cannot prescribe political change in the classroom. You also can't you cannot legislate education. You can say you can make legislation, everyone has to go to school, but you can't make a law that puts knowledge in someone's brain. So I think this is, it's just maybe a question of zooming in or out. I think zooming in very much. An educator can only educate and hope that there's change, but you cannot, in your education, directly change politics. So I think, it's how much you zoom in or out. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation and thank you for sharing a bit of your experiences. It was quite a pleasure. Thank you. I'm thinking philosophically about it. As you unpack inclusion, exclusion, it's sort of got the idea of the one is good, the other one is not good. And I'm just trying to reflect on it a bit critically in terms of what do you mean with, is that how you perceive it? Maybe it's just an impression I have, or perception, that it seems that inclusion is the good one.
Yes.
And exclusion is sort of the bad.
Yes.
Because it's exploitation in other linguistic. And that's actually my question. Is it really good to be included in all sorts of societies, communities, rituals? Is it sometimes not better to be excluded? Then you have a critical perspective. Inclusion sort of can become coercive and
yes. No, definitely.
Just as you unpacked them, I started thinking from another perspective on the same problem.
Yes. So, thank you. You're correct. I'm in the broad saying inclusion good, exclusion bad. Although I then say also that inclusion also has its own, the inclusion into public international law came with its own problems. And this is also, to go back to the quote right from the beginning, where ritual is something that can tie us together. But ritual and the rituals of law and the rituals of political power, Han says that ritual also can serve to solidify hierarchies. So inclusion itself, as you said, it's also problematic. And then the final part, what you're saying, maybe exclusion is the way out. Maybe we want to be excluded. Yeah, I understand that. I have sympathy with that. I think this is something I'm also still struggling with and thinking about. Do you want to be included or do you want to be excluded sometimes? Although maybe the point is who gets to choose if you get included or excluded. If you're included or excluded, it should be your choice at least. I don't know. That's a philosophical puzzle for us. Yes.
Yes, Nicola, thanks for a provoking presentation and congratulations for the computation. I've been thinking about the points that you've raised and one of the questions that keep bothering me is, are we going to be able to philosophize our way out of the current system that we have in the vested interest that we have in it? Or are we going to get to a point where there's a rupture, maybe as a result of a catastrophe, maybe linked to climate change or something, that will be able to trigger the type of change that we need? And when you watch a lot of our news channels and you follow international developments in here, countries like America always talk about China. That talks about the vested interest that people have in the system. They're not really willing to let things go and change.
Yes, I think I share exactly your concern. Of course, philosophizing and theorizing about this, I think that's very important, but I also realize that's not enough. I think in the next few decades, the world is in for a ride that we haven't experienced before. How it is going to play out is too complex for anyone to really grasp. So I don't know what is going to happen, but this rupture that you said, I think it's coming in our lifetime. Something very simple, not even talking about big power politics like America and China, even just migration. I mean, these are issues that the whole world will have to work together on. So I cannot give an answer, but I agree with you. We're not. I don't see the light. Okay, so I think the time is up.
You can. One last question.
I'm just curious as to perhaps commerce per se. West End will commerce perhaps start assisting in the inclusion process of a variety of different nations and states who never really were included in commerce to a large extent these days. And I think the International Chamber of Commerce is making also big strides in making. I know you spoke about legislation and laws and stuff, and that's the language that reach these people and bring and type people. Unfortunately, I mean that. But I do think that they make good strides in tying together and making rules which promote it. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, well, I think one of the most pressing issues for inclusion would be simply to address the material inequality around the world. If let's say it simply, the problem is poverty, and too many people are living in poverty, of course, in the world. And the more the world economy can cater to that, or can address that, that would be a massive step in the right direction. How effective it can do that, and how if it can do that well, I'm not sure, but that would definitely be a massive priority. But then, do you do that at the cost of the environment, for example? How do we do that? That's very difficult.
A few quick words of thank you. First of all, I want to thank Nico because we're celebrating you tonight. So that's the reason why we are all here. And I'm really happy that you finally get the opportunity to celebrate your research and all the hard work over the years. So we're really thankful to be here with you, especially I think your family and friends and also all of your colleagues here. So thank you very much for sharing this moment with us. Thank you for everyone who joined us here as well tonight. And then I would also like to say thank you to AOSIS, the publisher. They also kindly donated the book to the library, which we'll hand over to the library. So thank you very much for that. Anné, we already mentioned that. Thank you for the combined effort here. Appreciate it. And then lastly, but definitely not least, Red, you've already been mentioned. Really, if you take something on, it's absolutely perfect. So thank you so much for all your time and hard work that you've put into this. And yes, so you're all invited to join some refreshments with us just here in the foyer. Thank you very much.